What if your entire existence was a performance? What if the only way to survive was to become someone else entirely? Every word, every gesture, every thought meticulously controlled. And what if one mistake, one moment of authenticity meant the end? That's the world of Nepo, my new young adult sci-fi novel. And it's a world that, in many ways, reflects the reality that so many neurodivergent people live every single day. I'm Essie, an autistic and ADHD therapist, and I've spent years working with neurodivergent clients, helping them navigate the very real struggles of masking, identity, and survival in a world that demands their conformity. But long before I became a therapist, I was a writer, a storyteller, someone obsessed with world building, science fiction, and the power of speculative fiction to shine a light on our present-day reality. And Nepo, it's my love letter to all of that. I've always been drawn to storytelling. I studied journalism, attended film school, made documentaries, because at my core, I've always wanted to explore human experiences in a way that captivates, resonates, and challenges people to think. As someone who grew up undiagnosed autistic and ADHD, I spent much of my life feeling like an outsider, like I was missing some fundamental piece of the social puzzle. And when I became a therapist, I saw my clients grappling with the same feelings: the pressure to mask, to fit into neurotypical expectations, to suppress their natural ways of thinking, moving, and existing in order to be accepted. That's when it hit me. This was a story I needed to tell, a story about identity, autonomy, and the cost of living inauthentically. So I created Shayan, a clone of a long-dead Hollywood star, raised to be nothing more than a perfect replica of his first. His entire purpose is to adopt a persona, to erase himself in service of an industry that sees him as a product. But when he begins to question the system, to see the cracks in the world around him, he has to make an impossible choice: conform and survive, or rebel and risk everything. Sound familiar? That's because it isn't just science fiction. This is the lived reality of neurodivergence in an ableist world. I've always believed that the best science fiction holds up a mirror to reality. And when I started crafting the world of Nepo, I wanted to reflect something very real: the extreme divide between privilege and oppression. I lived in Los Angeles for 7 years. I saw firsthand the stark contrast between the ultra-wealthy living in gated enclaves and the struggling communities just a few miles away. As a therapist and social worker, I worked in those underprivileged areas. I saw the systemic barriers that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty and oppression. So I took that reality and imagined a future where the city is divided into two groups: the privileged enclavers who live in luxury, and the marginalized endies, a largely neurodivergent underclass whose skills power the city's technology and infrastructure. They are necessary, but never valued. If that sounds dystopian, it's because it is. But the scary thing, it's not much different from our world today. I've also always been fascinated by the way Hollywood operates, not just the glitz and glamour, but the darker, more insidious side of the industry, the way it packages and sells personas, shaping public perception while hiding the cracks beneath the surface. One of the biggest inspirations for Nepo was the way celebrities today are forced to maintain a brand, carefully curated, endlessly polished, and monitored for even the slightest deviation. Think about how actors are typecast, how pop stars are expected to maintain a certain image, how public figures are scrutinized for any perceived out-of-character behavior. Now imagine that pressure magnified 100-fold, where stepping out of line isn't just career-ending, it's life-threatening. That's the reality for Shayan. He doesn't just play a role, he is the role. And breaking free from it, that's not an option. I wanted to explore the idea that fame, at its core, is just another kind of performance, one that comes with expectations, obligations, and in many cases, a complete loss of personal autonomy. And that, to me, mirrors the experience of so many neurodivergents constantly being told to behave, how to present themselves, and what part of themselves are acceptable for public consumption. Because the truth is, fame isn't always freedom. Sometimes it's just a different kind of cage. What happens when every part of your life is a performance? When every word, every movement, every reaction is carefully curated, not because you want to, but because you have to. That's the reality for many neurodivergent people, and it's also the reality for my protagonist, Shayan, in Nepo. Just like celebrities are expected to maintain a flawless public image, neurodivergents are often expected to perform a version of themselves that's more acceptable. Masking is survival. It's watching how others behave and mimicking them, suppressing stims, forcing eye contact, regulating our speech to match social expectations. It's a constant checklist running in the back of our minds. Am I too loud? Did I interrupt too much? Am I making the right facial expressions? But masking comes at a cost. The longer we perform, the harder it becomes to know where the mask ends and where we begin. And the more we suppress our natural ways of thinking, moving, and expressing, the more we risk losing touch with our authentic selves. It's why so many neurodivergents experience burnout, not just from sensory overload alone, but from years of pretending to be someone they're not. That's exactly what Shayan struggles with. As a Nepo, his entire existence revolves around maintaining a persona that isn't his own. He has to be his first. If he deviates, he risks being retired, a literal, life-threatening version of what so many neurodivergents fear: rejection, exclusion, and being discarded for not fitting in. I wanted Nepo to explore the devastating weight of this expectation, because I've seen firsthand, both as a therapist and from my own experience, how damaging it can be. Masking can feel like a necessity, but over time, it becomes suffocating. And breaking free, that's one of the hardest things we ever do. On that point, when I started writing Nepo, I thought I was just telling a story. What I didn't realize was that I was also telling my story in a way I had never done before. Shayan's journey isn't just about defying a system that controls him, it's about self-discovery, about realizing that everything he struggled with, everything that made him feel out of place, actually has an explanation. He's neurodivergent, and that realization shifts everything. I had my own version of that moment. When I first learned I was autistic, it felt like my entire life up until that point suddenly made sense. It was a relief, but it also came with grief. Grief for all the years spent feeling broken, grief for all the times I was misunderstood, bullied, or dismissed, grief for not knowing sooner. Writing Nepo was a way for me to process all of that. Shayan's realization that he's neurodivergent mirrors what so many neurodivergents go through when they finally have the words to explain their experience. The egg crack moment describes that split second when you realize, I'm not broken, I'm just different. But coming to that realization is only the first step. What comes next is just as complicated, unpacking years of internalized ableism, shame, and survival mechanisms that were built to protect you, but now hold you back. That's what I wanted to explore in Nepo, the struggle of unmasking, of learning to embrace yourself when the world tells you to keep performing. Writing this book helped me do that for myself, and I hope that in some way it helps others do the same. It's no surprise that a lot of my own experiences made their way into this book. Like Shayan, I spent my teenage years feeling like an outsider. I was bullied, misread, constantly second-guessing myself. I walked funny, I spoke differently. I had no idea I was autistic and ADHD. I just knew that something about me seemed to rub people the wrong way. There's a scene in Nepo where Shayan lands a lead role in a school play, and a misunderstanding with a fellow performer spirals into a social disaster. That was pulled straight from my life. I once made a sarcastic joke that was completely misread, and suddenly I was public enemy number one. I didn't understand what had gone wrong, only that I had failed some unspoken social test. That's what it's like to be neurodivergent without knowing it. You're constantly aware that something is off, but you don't have the words for why. For Shayan, performing in that play becomes the moment he realizes he's different, that he might be neurodivergent. And for many of us, that moment of self-realization, of cracking the egg and seeing ourselves clearly for the first time, is life-changing. I classify Nepo as neuropunk because I wanted to create a subgenre that centers neurodivergent experiences in speculative fiction, just like cyberpunk explores technology and dystopia, or Afrofuturism envisions Black futures. Neuropunk is about neurodivergent futures. It's about exploring the way different brains experience the world, how societal structures control and suppress them, and how those who refuse to conform push back. In Nepo, that resistance takes the form of protagonist Shayan uncovering the corruption at the heart of the Hollywood system and questioning his own place in it. But in our world, that resistance looks like unmasking, like self-acceptance, like demanding accommodations and equity, instead of just scraping by in a world designed for neurotypicals. Neuropunk is a genre about refusing to disappear. That's why I think it's important. Science fiction has always been a way for us to grapple with real-world problems in a way that feels just removed enough to be palatable. It allows us to take things we might not want to face head-on, oppression, ableism, power structures, and explore them in a setting that feels like escapism. That's why I love writing in this genre. In Nepo, I'm not just talking about neurodivergence. I'm talking about systemic inequality, about the way society exploits marginalized groups for their labor while denying them basic rights, about how institutions use fear and control to maintain power. That's not just fiction, it's history, it's reality, it's happening right now. I think the reason speculative fiction resonates so deeply with so many people, especially readers with marginalized identities like neurodivergence, is because it provides a safe space to process these experiences. It gives us distance so we can examine injustice without being overwhelmed by it. And sometimes it gives us hope, because if we can imagine a different future, maybe we can build one. That's what I hope Nepo does. I want it to be more than just a gripping sci-fi story. I want it to be a conversation, a reflection, a challenge. At its heart, Nepo is about questioning what normal really means. Society tells us that to be normal is to conform. Neurodivergents hear this message every day. Sit still, stop fidgeting, you need to make eye contact. Just try harder. We're told over and over that if we just suppress our natural instincts, our need to stim, our unique ways of thinking, our sensory sensitivities, then we'll be accepted. But at what cost? Shayan is living that reality on an extreme scale. His entire survival depends on maintaining a false persona. And the more he conforms, the more he loses himself. That's the core struggle of so many neurodivergents today. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice just to belong? Another reason I wrote Nepo is because I didn't see myself in books growing up. The characters who were quirky, socially awkward, or intense were often played for laughs, sidelined as comic relief, or used as a cautionary tale. The ones who struggled with sensory overload, hyperfixations, or emotional regulation were either villainized or fixed by the end of the story. And if they did exist, they weren't labeled, they weren't celebrated, they were often misunderstood by both the characters in the book and the readers themselves. Nepo is for fellow neurodivergent readers who deserve stories where they aren't just side characters or stereotypes, where they aren't reduced to the weird friend or the troubled genius or the emotionless robot. They deserve protagonists who reflect their struggles, their strengths, and their unique way of seeing the world. We need more stories that acknowledge the real challenges of neurodivergence, masking, burnout, social anxiety, but also ones that celebrate the joy of it, the way our brains work differently, the way we see patterns others don't, the way we can hyperfocus and build entire worlds in our heads. Shayan is my answer to that. He's not a caricature, he's not a diagnosis checklist in human form, he's a fully realized character navigating a world that wasn't built for him, just like so many of us. Because at the end of the day, representation isn't just about being seen, it's about being understood, and it's about knowing, without a doubt, that you belong in the world of stories. Another reason I wrote Nepo is because I wanted to tell a damn good story. First and foremost, that's my goal, because no one wants to read a book that feels like a lecture. But beneath the sci-fi action, the dystopian setting, and the mystery at its core, I want readers especially neurodivergent ones, to feel seen. I want them to know they're not broken. I want them to know that their struggles aren't their fault. I want them to know that authenticity isn't a weakness, it's a strength. For neurotypical readers, I hope the book sparked reflection. I hope it challenges the way they see neurodivergence, not as a flaw, but as a different way of being that deserves respect, accommodation, and space to thrive. Because the world doesn't need more clones of the same thing, it needs new perspectives, new ways of thinking, new voices. If any of this has intrigued you, you can grab a free copy of Nepo for a limited time at the link on my profile. All I ask is that you leave a review, let me know what you think, what resonated with you, and what you took away from the story. I can't wait for you to read it, and I can't wait to hear what you think. Because at the end of the day, stories are meant to be shared, and I hope Nepo finds a place in yours. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.